still hadn't finished school. When my father was transferred from a small town in Montana to the remote outskirts of Louisiana, the friendships of school life run deep, and leaving my friends behind broke my heart. At the train station, people gathered around my father, many of them crying openly. He was respected as an honest and fair officer, and the sorrow on everyone's faces made the goodbye even harder for me. By the time we arrived in a quiet district near Baton Rouge, a welcoming crowd had already gathered. Officials greeted my parents with flowers and warm smiles, but none of it could lift the heaviness in my chest. The government residences stood together in a large compound. The homes of the sheriff, the district judge, the chief medical officer, and other important officials. In the center sat an old pond with stone steps leading into the dark water. The houses were strange compared to what I had known before. Wooden walls woven in old Southern style, polished floors, broad porches, and huge iron gates. When we entered our assigned bungalow, I remember thinking how beautiful and unusual it looked. Night had already fallen. After dinner, everyone prepared for bed. That was when we first heard it. From somewhere above the ceiling came the sharp crack of a whip, then a woman screaming. The sound was so sudden and horrifying that I froze in place. At first, I thought I had imagined it, until I realized the entire house had heard it too. 8 armed guards were stationed outside the bungalow. My father immediately questioned them. They nervously admitted that strange noises had been heard there before, though nobody had ever discovered the source. Because my father feared nothing, he ordered 2 guards to climb up and inspect the attic space above the ceiling. They returned pale-faced. Nothing was there. But the sounds had stopped the moment they climbed up. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I woke with the strange feeling that someone was breathing beside my neck. Slow, cold, human. Then I felt fingers, ice-cold fingers brushing across my throat. My older sister, who had always been terrified of the dark, suddenly rushed into my room and climbed into my bed without saying much. "I'm sleeping here tonight," she whispered. I understood immediately why, but I pretended not to. I quietly recited every prayer I knew and eventually fell asleep. Morning came. Sunlight spilled through the windows and life seemed normal again. My mother walked toward the kitchen while the cook prepared breakfast outside. I said nothing, but the same thing continued for nights afterward. The whip, the screaming, the cold breathing near my throat, and one night, I felt something even stranger, as if invisible fingers were trying to pull the delicate bones from my neck. I didn't dare open my eyes. The next morning at dawn prayer, I stepped out of bed and felt something beneath my foot. Looking down, I nearly screamed. On the carpet beside the bed lay 2 thin bones, human neck bones. My sister's and mine. At least that's what they looked like to us in our terrified young minds. That morning, I told my mother everything. Months passed. The strange events continued in scattered bursts, never fully disappearing. During that time, I grew close to our old cook, Uncle Raymond. Every night I would tell him what I'd experienced. He would only nod slowly and say, "Yes, child. These things happen here." Winter arrived soon after. My grandmother came to stay with us, while my father traveled to a nearby parish for official work. Usually I went everywhere with him, but since Grandma was visiting, I stayed home. That night, cold rain tapped softly against the windows while icy wind moved through the trees. Then everyone became sick. My mother, my sister, even my grandmother. By 10 o'clock, the entire house had gone silent. No television, no music, just darkness and rain. I stayed awake reading an old mystery novel, trying to keep watch over everyone. Then I heard it. My grandmother calling my name. I rushed to her room. She was asleep. I returned to my room. Then I heard my mother calling me. Again, I hurried down the hallway. She too was fast asleep. The third time, I heard my sister's voice. Panicked now, I ran to her room, only to find her deeply asleep as well. A freezing sensation crawled across my skin. This was no misunderstanding. Something was calling me. Something inside the house. I remembered what elders used to say, "Fear gives evil strength." So I fought to stay calm. I recited every verse and prayer I knew, especially Ayatul Kursi, which my mother had taught me as a child. Eventually, I returned to my room and lay beneath my blanket without hanging the mosquito net. A few minutes later, I felt the mattress sink near my feet. Someone had sat down. At first, I tried to reason with myself. The doors were locked. Guards stood outside. Nobody could have entered. Still, I could feel it. Someone was there. Slowly, I lowered the blanket from my face. A woman sat at the foot of my bed. She wore a gray veil over her head and stared directly at me with a small, unnatural smile. I nearly screamed, but forced myself silent. "No fear," I whispered to myself repeatedly. I kept reciting prayers under my breath. At one point, gathering every ounce of courage I had, I kicked toward her. My foot passed through nothing. That was the moment true terror entered me, because I realized something impossible. She had shape, but no body. Again and again, I peeked from beneath the blanket. Each time she remained there, smiling. One of my bedroom windows was always left slightly open, no matter the season. Outside that window grew a fragrant jasmine tree whose scent drifted into my room at night. Every few moments, I glanced toward the window, hoping to see one of the guards outside. Time crawled endlessly. Then finally, the distant sound of the dawn prayer echoed through the darkness. The woman suddenly stood. Without taking her eyes off me, she moved backward toward the window. And then, impossibly, she passed straight through the iron bars and dissolved into the jasmine tree outside. I sat frozen in disbelief. That morning, I told my mother everything. Later that day, she sent for an old spiritual healer known throughout the area, a man people claimed never accepted money for helping others. After hearing the entire story, he stared at my forehead for a long moment before asking to see my room. When he reached the window beside the jasmine tree, his expression changed. He whispered prayers softly, then blew toward the tree in the window frame. Finally, he turned to me and said, "After the evening prayer, keep this window closed until dawn. No matter what you hear, do not open it." Before leaving, he quietly explained what he believed had happened. Years earlier, a young woman had been murdered beneath that jasmine tree and secretly buried there. Her remains had long since turned to dust, but according to him, her spirit never left. After that night, I continued hearing soft knocks at the window after dark, but I never opened it again. The sounds of whipping and screaming above the ceiling continued from time to time, yet the cold breathing beside my neck and the woman at my bedside never returned. Now, decades later, after finishing university and spending nearly 30 years teaching literature, I still cannot forget what happened in that Louisiana bungalow. What truly happened there? Who or what haunted that house? Even today, I still have no answer. I woke up startled by the sound of knocking on the door in the middle of the night. Annoyed, I got up and opened the door. As soon as I opened it, I exclaimed in surprise, "Are you at this hour?" Akash smiled brightly and said, "Bro, I haven't seen you in so long. I really missed you, so I came over. I'll spend the night with you tonight." Akash was my childhood friend. We grew up together. His house was about 2 kilometers away from mine. Because of our busy schedules, we hadn't met for nearly a month. I couldn't believe he had come all the way to my house at this late hour just to see me. That's what true friendship is. "Why are you standing outside?" "Come in," I said. "Let's chat all night like old times." "No, bro. I don't want to sit inside. Let's go out for a walk," he replied. I was shocked. "What? Where do you want to go at this hour? And since when did you become so brave? Just a few days ago, you wouldn't even step outside after evening because you were scared of ghosts. What happened to that Akash?" "Those days are gone now," Akash said with a wide smile. "Look how beautiful the moon is in the sky tonight." "Yeah, but what's wrong with you? You've been so quiet since you arrived," I asked. Akash smiled faintly and said, "Nothing. From now on, I've decided I'll stay alone. I made that decision this evening. I was alone all night, but I got really scared, so I came to get you." I was stunned again. "You were alone? You got scared? What are you even saying? Where were you all night?" "Outside the house." "Why? Did your family throw you out?" "No, they didn't throw me out. Why would they? I left on my own." I was completely confused. Akash suddenly grabbed my hand and said, "Bro, can you come to my house for a bit? Mom is crying a lot for me. Please tell her that I'm fine." "I'm very fine. Tell her not to cry for me anymore." I stared at him, utterly bewildered. "I don't understand anything you're saying." "Why did you leave the house? What happened? Come on, I'll take you home." No, bro. I'm not going home today. I'll go some other day. But please, just go there for me. Mom is crying so much. Saying this, Akash hugged me tightly and started sobbing. It is now 3:30 in the morning. I am standing in front of Akash's house. No matter what I said, I couldn't get him to come with me. I had told him, you wait in my room. I'll go tell Aunt that you're with me and you're fine. But he refused. He stayed standing on the road. He said he would go back to my house with me after I spoke to his mother. I still couldn't understand what was happening. Because of Akash's crying, I had no choice but to come to his house at this dead hour. I stood there frozen like a statue. Aunt hugged me tightly and cried uncontrollably. I didn't know how to console her. Everything felt chaotic and unreal. The whole house was filled with the sound of mourning. Many people had gathered. The police were carrying Akash's body away. That evening, Akash had hanged himself in his room. My mind slowly began to lose its grip on reality. What was I hearing? Then who was I with all this time? Akash himself had asked me to come to his house. I watched as his body was loaded into the police van. It was the last time I saw Akash. My entire world began to spin. Everything around me seemed to be shaking. People in front of my eyes slowly moved farther away. I felt myself slipping into a dark void. In the distance, someone was crying. And through those cries, I could faintly hear a voice saying, "Tell Mom that I'm fine." I stood there frozen like a statue. Aunt hugged me tightly and cried uncontrollably. I didn't know how to console her. Everything felt chaotic and unreal. The whole house was filled with the sound of mourning. Many people had gathered. The police were carrying Akash's body away. That evening, Akash had hanged himself in his room. My mind slowly began to lose its grip on reality. What was I hearing? Then who was I with all this time? Akash himself had asked me to come to his house. I watched as his body was loaded into the police van. It was the last time I saw Akash. My entire world began to spin. Everything around me seemed to be shaking. People in front of my eyes slowly moved farther away. I felt myself slipping into a dark void. In the distance, someone was crying. And through those cries, I could faintly hear a voice saying, "Tell Mom that I'm fine." This is our third story for tonight's episode of The Nightman. This chilling account was sent to us all the way from France by a man named Sebastian. The story is titled, White Mice. It is a real and horrific event from Sebastian's life. A tragedy that cost his wife her life and left him trapped in an unimaginable and terrifying situation inside his own home. Let's hear the story directly in Sebastian's own words. Bonjour, my name is Sebastian and I come from France. I live in a suburb of Paris with my wife, Sabine. We met in a nightclub just a few months ago. When I saw her lithe figure on the dance floor, she took my breath away. I never believed in love at first sight. But as I watched her slow, graceful movements as she danced, I knew that she would be my wife. Sabine is a deeply passionate woman, highly sensual, sultry, and seductive. However, she also had a dark side. Sometimes she was loving and caring and did everything in her power to please me. At other times, she could be cold-blooded and cruel, with a quick and poisonous tongue. Sabine wore her emotions on her sleeve and could be quite a handful. When we began seeing each other, I had to learn to adjust to her moods. Within the space of a few minutes, she could go from quiet, pleasant and relaxed to loud, angry, and vicious. I had to be careful because even the slightest thing could set her off. We had only been dating for 1 month when I asked her to marry me. My friends said I was rushing into things, but I was worried that some other guy would come along and sweep her off her feet. In the days and weeks after the wedding, we were inseparable. Often we would spend the morning cuddling in bed. Sabine would coil herself around me and lay gentle kisses on my neck. However, it wasn't long before her attitude towards me began to change. She grew sullen and withdrawn and started pressuring me to have children. I told her it was too soon and said that we should wait until our financial situation was better. But Sabine was incorrigible. All she talked about was having babies. It was as if she was obsessed. "What should we name our children?" she asked one day as I was trying to read the newspaper. "I don't know," I replied, a little irritated. "I haven't thought about it much." "Well, I have," said Sabine. "If we have boys, I will call them Simon, Sylvester, Seymour, Stephen, and Cedric. If they are girls, then Solange, Sylvia, Sandrine, Suzanne, Selena, and Cynthia. I didn't reply and just returned to my paper. One hot afternoon in the middle of summer, Sabine and I were lying on deck chairs, sunning ourselves on the terrace. I glanced over at my beautiful wife and noticed something odd about the skin on her legs. It was peeling off. "Sabine," I said, "you're getting burned." I reached out and put my hand on her thigh. Her skin felt rough and scaly. She groaned lazily. "Don't worry, darling, it's nothing." "It's not nothing, Sabine," I said. "I want you to see the doctor about this skin condition of yours. I'm worried. It could be serious." The next morning, despite my wife's protests, I accompanied her to the dermatologist. He examined her for a while but couldn't figure out what was wrong. However, he assured us that it was not serious and would probably clear up on its own. He gave Sabine a balm to apply to her skin twice a day and advised her to stay out of the sun for the time being. On the way home, we passed a pet store. Sabine stopped and stared through the shop window. Her face broke out into a smile. "Oh, look, Sebastian," she exclaimed. "They're so cute." I raised my eyebrows when I saw what she was pointing at. It was a cage full of white mice. They were crawling all over each other, and the sight of their flesh-colored tails swinging back and forth sent a chill down my spine. I thought it was a completely hideous sight. But before I could object, my wife was already entering the store. "But Sabine, we can't—" "Oh, stop being such a killjoy," she cried. "There'll be so much fun for our children to play with." "But Sabine, we don't have any kids." She burst into tears. "Come on, Sabine, calm down," I pleaded. "Everyone is watching us." I tried to hug her, but she wriggled out of my grasp and pushed me away. "No, don't touch me," she cried. "I know you don't love me. That's why you refuse to have children with me." I tried to reassure her, telling her I loved her more than ever, but it was no use. She remained angry and brooded, wordlessly, until I finally relented and took out my wallet. The pet shop owner handed me a cage and a box with holes in the side. By the time we left, Sabine was smiling again, as if we had never argued. An hour later, we arrived home with the white mice. I placed the cage on a dressing table in our bedroom and put the scurrying creatures inside. They ran to and fro, exploring their new home. I counted 1, 2, 3, a total of 18 white mice. It was too much. I sighed and went to the bathroom. Relaxing in a cold bath, I tried to relieve my mind of the stresses of the day. After about half an hour, I got out, dried myself, and returned to the bedroom to dress. When I passed by the cage, I saw the mice still scurrying around and sniffing with their noses in the air. I counted them again. 1, 2, 3. There were only 17 white mice. One must have escaped. I searched the room, looking high and low, but I couldn't find any sign of it. "Sabine," I called. "I think one of the mice got out of the cage." There was no reply. When I went looking for my wife, I found her lying on the terrace, basking in the sun. "Sabine, what are you doing?" I cried. "The doctor told you not to go out in the sun." "What about your skin?" She lowered her sunglasses and stared up at me with a venomous look. "Can't you let me be?" she hissed. Then she turned over, yawned, and stretched out like a lizard on a rock. I shrugged my shoulders. I was too tired to argue with her, so I lay down on a deck chair. Before long, I was dozing off. When I awoke, the sun was setting and Sabine's deck chair was empty. I was alone on the terrace. Rubbing my eyes, I got up and walked to the bedroom. Pausing at the door, I peeked inside and saw Sabine sitting cross-legged on our bed. The cage was at her feet and the top lay open. As I watched, she licked her lips and reached inside, picking up one of the white mice. My wife held the tiny creature up above her, dangling it by the tail. Then, to my horror, she threw back her head, opened her jaw wide, and dropped the mouse into her mouth. Her lips closed around it, engulfing it, and she began to chew. I could hear its tiny bones crunching between her teeth. Then, with one big gulp, she swallowed the mouse whole. I held my hand to my mouth, stifling a scream and trying not to vomit. Despite my efforts, I let a little squeak slip out and she turned to look at me. Her eyes grew wide with surprise. "Sebastian," she hissed. "Sorry, sweetheart, you weren't supposed to see that." Before I could say another word, she pounced on me like a coiled spring and wrapped her arms and legs around my body. She began squeezing me, crushing my torso between her supple limbs. I struggled desperately, unable to breathe. All of the air was being squeezed out of my lungs. I started to lose consciousness. Before I blacked out, I managed to free one of my hands and reached out to grab the first thing I lay hands on. It was a lamp. I began beating Sabine over the head with it, and then everything went black. When I woke up, I found myself lying on the floor. Sabine's dead body lay beside me, her head soaked in blood. I burst into tears and cradled her in my arms for a few minutes. Then I composed myself and called the police. When they arrived and took a look at the scene, they arrested me. Initially, they planned to charge me with murder. But when they did an autopsy, they discovered the contents of my wife's stomach, 5 partially digested white mice. They realized I was telling the truth. In the end, the police believed that Sabine had gone insane and, thinking she was a snake, tried to crush me and eat me alive. They closed the case and released me without charge. I was allowed to go home. When I reached the house, I felt sad, lonely, and depressed. The place was so empty without Sabine. Despite what had happened, I still loved her and I blamed myself for her death. If only I had known she was losing her mind. Perhaps I could have saved her. Going upstairs to the bedroom, I took off my shirt and pants. I wanted to take a bath and just forget about everything. It was then that I noticed the cage. It was empty. All of the white mice were gone. I looked around the room, but there was no trace of them. Just then, I noticed that the bed sheets were moving and undulating. With shaking hands, I reached out and pulled back the bedspread. Underneath, there were several little babies, slithering back and forth over the sheets. They all turned their heads and looked up at me with blazing red eyes. Their mouths opened and their forked tongues poked out as they said, in unison, "S salute, Daddy."